Let's now have a look at another kind of hook, that is useCallback hook. The useCallback hook is a powerful React hook that helps you to optimize your application by preventing unnecessary re-renders. It can help you increase the performance of your React components, which will result in a better user experience. Now, what exactly useCallback does is to memoize a function. Means it returns a memoized version of the callback that only changes if one of its dependencies changes. Alright, so we would be better able to understand once we have implemented the example. But let's first try to understand this memoize. We have a term called as memoization. It's an optimization technique used to speed up computer programs by storing the results of expensive or complex function calls and then returning the cached result when the same inputs occur again. It essentially involves caching the output of a function based on its inputs so that when the function is called with the same inputs. So this is important here. When the function is called with the same inputs, the stored result is returned instead of recomputing it. So when we talk about memoization in the context of React, this technique is often used to prevent unnecessary recalculations or re-rendering of components when their inputs haven't changed. So inputs here we can refer to either props or the states. So this will not only reduce the redundant calculations, but also will save the computational resources by reusing previously calculated results. We are now going to understand the same with the help of an example. I'm already having one example here wherein you see we increase the counter, it increases by 1, decreasing the counter will decrease it by 1, and we also have an increase number, that is another variable, and it will increase it by 1. So pretty simple example. Let's take a look. We are having 3 functions: increment counter, decrement counter, and increment number. Quite simple functions as we already have seen in the previous useState examples. We are having count and number as the initial states, while setCount and setNumber represent the functions that will be used for changing the state. Further, we are also having a console.log statement, that is component rendered, and we are using the 2 variables, that is count and number, in order to render the updated value. Finally, we do have a child component where we are passing the 3 functions as the props to the child component. So let's take a look at the child component now. Inside the child component, we are passing the 3 functions which are specified inside the parent component. We are passing them as props here. We also have a console.log statement here. We are having 3 buttons inside this child component using 3 on-click events and using the same functions: increment counter, decrement counter, and increment number. So again, very simple functionality. So what exactly we are trying to understand then? Let's take a look on the browser again. We will open the console. So when I refresh, what you see is we are having component rendered and child component rendered being printed in the console. This statement is in the parent component and this statement is in the child component. So once you are initializing, whenever you are going to the browser and rendering the component for the very first time, these 2 statements will always be printed. But when I'm clicking on increase counter, it is re-rendering the component. When I am clicking on decrease counter, it is re-rendering again. Clicking on increasing the number is also re-rendering the component. So why does this happen? Let's take a look once again. I'm reloading. For the very first time, both parent and child components are rendering. Whenever I'm clicking on any of the buttons, both the components are re-rendering every time. This results in performance issues. It's okay if the parent component is re-rendering, but there is no need for the child component to render again and again. The reason is because it's the same kind of logic that we are using. It's nothing more than plus and minus. What exactly is happening? We are passing the three functions as the props. You can see we are using here, while rendering the child component, we are using them as the attributes. And the same are being passed as the props here. Now we need to know something about the references here. So in JavaScript, the functions are objects, and each time you define a function, it gets a new reference. So means every single function is having a new reference here. It means that when you redefine increment counter, decrement counter, and increment number on each render, each of these functions has a different reference compared to the previous render. So when you are passing these functions as props to the child component sees that the props have changed because their references are different. So that's the reason that this will trigger a re-render in the child component, even if the logic inside those functions remain the same. We have a solution for the same, and this can be easily avoided with the help of useCallback hook. So first of all, we are going to import the useCallback hook. And all that is required to do is, you will be required to use the useCallback here. The useCallback function accepts a callback function. So whatsoever the function you are having here, you will be required to place it again. So your function is here. Same way you can go for the second one, use callback. And we are going to place the whole function inside the use callback. And finally, the last one. We also need to pass an empty dependency array in these functions because we want that these functions should not depend on any changing values. So that's why we are passing the empty dependency. So now we have used the use callback in order to memoize all these callback functions so that the same function reference is returned on every render unless the dependencies change. But we are now passing the empty dependency, so means that component should not re-render. You can say that now we are returning a memoized function. The return value of use callback hook is a memoized function. Now let's come back to the child component. We are also required to use a higher order component called ReactMem. This will memoize the rendered output. It will only re-render the component when the props change. So this react.memo component is going to prevent the unnecessary render of this child component, while the use callback hook here is returning a memoized function. Let's get back to the results. what do you see is your child component does not re-render, because now you're using useCallback to memoize the function and pass it as a prop to your child component. Your child component will not re-render unless the function's dependencies have changed. So React keeps the same function reference across the renders if its dependency have not changed. This means that the child component will receive the same function reference on its subsequent renders. That's all. See you in the next video.